When the German prisoners stepped off the transport trains, the air felt different. Not the choking dust of North Africa, nor the frost of Europe, but open, clean air that smelled faintly of pine and diesel. They had crossed an ocean under guard, expecting punishment or humiliation. Instead, they found silence, discipline, and order. The American guards at the harbor didn't shout. They simply directed lines of POWs toward buses marked US Army Transportation Corps. Many Germans whispered among themselves, astonished at the condition of the vehicles. Every truck, every bus, painted freshly, engines humming smoothly. One officer murmured, "So this is how they move men, efficiently." For months, Nazi propaganda had portrayed America as chaotic, a land of jazz, crime, and racial division. Now, the prisoners watched endless rows of vehicles move with precision. The shock wasn't fear, it was disbelief. How could an enemy so young, so far away, organize like this? Their journey had begun in Tunisia, Sicily, and Normandy. Captured soldiers from Rommel's Afrika Korps and later from the Western Front filled these transports. The Geneva Convention protected them, but they expected hardship. Instead, many would soon realize they were entering one of the largest, most organized wartime systems on Earth. The convoy rolled through towns where civilians waved or stared silently. Children pointed at them, not with hatred, but curiosity. Some POWs lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others studied the houses, the clean streets, the bridges without bomb scars. By the time they reached the first camp in Texas, evening shadows stretched long over the fences. Floodlights flickered on, but there was no yelling, no dogs. Inside, they saw barracks made of wood, with glass windows and bunks built precisely in rows. Every detail spoke of planning and resources, even for captives. In the mess hall, a sergeant handed them metal trays. Food, beans, bread, coffee, and meat. For many, it was the first time in months they'd eaten real meat. They stared in silence, unsure if it was a trick. Then one man laughed, a dry, broken laugh, and began to eat. Letters from home had been rare and filtered through censors. Now Red Cross representatives explained their rights, rations, and camp rules. They would work in fields or factories under supervision, receive medical care, and could buy soap or postcards at the canteen. It wasn't freedom, but it was order. One German engineer, a former Volkswagen technician, whispered to his comrade, "Look at the saws, look at the generators." He had never seen so many machines in one place. Even our factories in Wolfsburg don't have this many spares. At night, the prisoners lay in their bunks, listening to the hum of electric lines outside. America was lit even in the dark. Some realized that this light, the steady glow of power lines and factories, was more terrifying than any weapon. Days turned into routine. They marched to fields, cut timber, or repaired equipment under guard. American officers observed everything with clipboards and watches. Efficiency was not a gesture, it was a religion. To the POWs, the most incredible thing was the abundance of machines. Tractors, trucks, conveyors, many idle, waiting for use. In Germany, such resources were guarded and rationed. Here they seemed endless. Some Americans spoke German fluently, often with college accents. They asked questions not as interrogators but as curious humans. This psychological contrast confused many soldiers who expected hatred. Instead, they found a society that treated them like men, not enemies. Every evening, the POWs heard distant factory sirens marking shift changes. Steam trains passed carrying steel, timber, and fuel toward coastal ports. Even here, hundreds of miles from the front, America's war machine never slept. For many Germans, this became their first lesson in industrial might. They saw ordinary Americans, farmers, mechanics, women in uniforms, working without fear of bombs. Their towns were safe, their assembly lines were alive, and their factories ran 3 shifts a day. The contrast to Germany was devastating. Back home, cities like Hamburg and Cologne burned night after night. Rail lines were broken, fuel scarce, and civilians hid in shelters. Here, the enemy was building airplanes and tractors at once, without pause. Within weeks, American officers allowed camp bands and libraries. Books from Goethe to Mark Twain lined wooden shelves. Some POWs attended English classes or wrote essays for camp newspapers. The irony was clear. Prisoners were studying democracy while their homeland tightened control. One diary entry from a German sergeant later read, "We were captured soldiers, but we entered a world of machines and freedom. We expected chains and found production." By Christmas 1944, many POWs had written home about the strange fairness of their captors. Letters were inspected but not altered. Even the presence of a tree in the canteen became a symbol of decency amid war. For the Americans, it was simple: treat prisoners well, so their own men would be treated well overseas. For the Germans, it was a window into the scale of America's production engine. And for history, it was the beginning of a transformation inside thousands of minds. The realization that this enemy was not barbaric, but unstoppably modern. As winter deepened, snow covered the barbed wire fences. The prisoners gathered by pot-bellied stoves inside their barracks. Some talked quietly of home, others of machines. And one mechanic from Hanover said, "I think we already lost the war, the day we saw how they build." The German prisoners soon realized that American captivity was not chaos. It was a system, detailed, structured, and quietly powerful. Every movement was timed. Every form had a purpose. Even captivity felt industrial. At dawn, a bugle sounded. Not for war, but for order. Roll calls were precise. Names recorded. Ranks verified. Assignments distributed. There was no shouting, only the rhythm of bureaucracy. In Camp Hearn, Texas, and Camp Algona, Iowa, routines began before sunrise. Prisoners swept the grounds, polished tools, and reported for labor. Work details rotated weekly: agriculture, carpentry, machine maintenance. Each man had a role in a miniature reflection of the American war machine. The camp officers, often reserve soldiers or teachers before the war, ran everything like clockwork. Schedules were written in chalk on bulletin boards. Breakfast at 0600, work trucks depart at 0700, inspection at noon, mail at dusk. Nothing was improvised. Many Germans found this unnerving. Discipline without fear. In the Reich, structure came through command. Here, it came through efficiency. The result was obedience, not through punishment, but through organization. The Red Cross visited regularly, ensuring compliance with the Geneva Convention. Their reports noted that America treated over 400,000 Axis prisoners with consistency, no matter rank or origin. Uniforms were washed weekly, food rations equal to US troops, and medical care standardized. Even the infirmary had fluorescent lighting and clean linens, a rarity in wartime Europe. German officers were separated from enlisted men. They were given more privileges, but also more responsibility. Some supervised education programs, teaching English, mathematics, or even engineering. The camp became an accidental university behind barbed wire. Work crews built barns, harvested crops, and repaired county roads. For every hour worked, they earned scrip money to buy soap, writing paper, or tobacco. Some even purchased small radios to hear censored news broadcasts. They were captives, yet the illusion of control lingered. The guards themselves were often young Americans, students, farmers, or clerks in uniform. They spoke casually, sometimes exchanging cigarettes. Many had never left the United States, and yet they were the face of a superpower. Calm, methodical, confident. German POWs began to take notes, sketches of camp layouts, supply chains, and daily operations. They realized the American system depended less on ideology and more on logistics. Efficiency was cultural. Resources flowed downward smoothly, without corruption or privilege. A captured Luftwaffe engineer later wrote, "They had fewer officers and more organization. We had more officers and less trust. Even punishment was procedural. A late worker lost privileges, not food. A fight meant confinement, not beating. Rules were obeyed not because of terror, but because they made sense." Camps across the Midwest mirrored this pattern. In Arkansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, each followed the same blueprints. The same wooden barracks, the same kitchens, the same supply depots. Replication became a form of strength. The food was repetitive but sufficient. Beans, bread, coffee, meat on Sundays. And every week, trains arrived with new supplies, right on schedule. To men who had lived through Allied bombings, such punctuality seemed surreal. War had not reached these plains. Production had replaced fear. German officers observed the American quartermaster system closely. To them, it was stunning. Materials, food, and fuel moved with invisible precision. Paperwork flowed faster than orders ever did in the Wehrmacht. In evenings, prisoners gathered under yellow bulbs, talking quietly about home. Some wondered if their families were safe from the air raids. Others wondered how this country, so calm, so mechanical, could wage war on two fronts. It felt impossible. Yet it was happening. One POW teacher began keeping a small log of the system's behavior. He drew maps of transport routes and supply patterns. Later, he would remark, "If Germany had half this order in logistics, perhaps we would not have lost Africa." The American guards rarely boasted. To them, efficiency was not power. It was normal life. Farms grew, factories ran, and trains moved on time. War was simply another extension of production. Some Germans began to compare notes about American democracy. How could such a system, based on freedom and debate, create such discipline? One answer repeated often: freedom had made the workers believe in their work. They built because they wanted to, not because they feared to. By 1944, many prisoners had developed a strange respect for their captors. They did not envy the power, they envied the method. America's strength was not in weapons alone, but in the harmony between machine and man. The camps, once symbols of defeat, became schools of observation, and for thousands of German soldiers, those lessons would stay long after the war ended. By the spring of 1944, labor had become the heartbeat of every POW camp in America. The war effort required hands, and the prisoners became part of the machinery of production. They were not slaves nor free men, but essential gears in a vast industrial rhythm. American law allowed the use of POW labor under the Geneva Convention. As long as the work was not directly military, it was considered lawful. So the Germans harvested cotton, cut lumber, repaired roads, and processed food. Each day began with movement, trucks rolling out, tools clanking, boots in rhythm. In Texas, they picked pecans and built irrigation canals. In Nebraska, they repaired railway ties. In Minnesota, they cut timber in the frozen woods. Each task was a reminder. America was building not only weapons, but continuity. For many Germans, these farms and factories were their first encounter with American civilians. The guards watched carefully, but hostility was rare. Farmers greeted them with cautious curiosity, and sometimes gratitude, because these men kept the crops alive while American sons fought overseas. A POW once recalled, "They gave us work, and through that, they gave us dignity." The irony was not lost. In the Reich, obedience had been enforced. Here, responsibility was earned. Camp libraries grew busier than ever. Books arrived from universities, churches, and civic groups. Classrooms formed in barracks: English, mathematics, philosophy. Some POWs even studied American literature, translating Steinbeck and Twain into German. For the first time, the idea of democracy entered their conversations, not as propaganda but as curiosity. How could such freedom create order? How could a society of equals win a war through efficiency? Lectures were sometimes taught by prisoners themselves, engineers, professors, or theologians. American officers quietly allowed it. Education, they believed, could prevent bitterness and rebellion. It worked. Every few weeks, Red Cross representatives inspected the classes. Reports praised the educational atmosphere. The camp resembles a small technical college. Some prisoners earned informal diplomas. Others wrote essays comparing American and German systems. Evenings brought music, violins, accordions, and makeshift pianos. Camp orchestras played Bach and jazz side by side. The sounds drifted beyond the fences, blending with the distant hum of American trains. It was the sound of two worlds colliding without hatred. One POW named Franz, a teacher from Bremen, began teaching English conversation. He used words like hope, repair, and future. His students practiced, smiling awkwardly, unaware that these words would someday define their new lives after the war. The American guards often listened quietly. Some joined in discussions about politics and philosophy. The atmosphere became one of cautious respect, not friendship, but understanding. It was education by proximity. POW newspapers emerged, written in German, reviewed by American censors. Articles discussed farming techniques, mechanical design, even theatre. One editorial simply read, "The real victory is the victory of understanding." That phrase would later echo across many post-war memoirs. The camps, unintentionally, had become incubators of democratic thought. The seeds planted in confinement would one day help rebuild Germany itself. By 1945, when the war in Europe ended, many POWs no longer saw themselves as soldiers. They had become craftsmen, teachers, thinkers, and though fences still stood, their minds were already free. When the time for repatriation came, thousands requested to stay. Some were allowed to return only months later, reluctantly leaving the quiet fields of America. They carried notebooks, drawings, and lessons, not of defeat, but of transformation. One diary entry found decades later said it best. "They took our weapons, but gave us tools. They took our freedom, but gave us thought." For every German prisoner, the war continued quietly inside the heart. Fences and watchtowers could contain the body, not the longing. Home existed in ink and paper. Letters were lifelines. Each message traveled thousands of miles, censored, delayed, and stamped approved by US Army. Still, they carried warmth, a connection stronger than politics or defeat. Every week, Red Cross trucks arrived with bundles of envelopes. Names were called out in alphabetical order. Men stood silently, hands trembling as they waited for familiar handwriting. Some received nothing for months. Others held pages so many times the paper grew thin. They wrote on brown stationery, careful and formal. They avoided military details, politics, or complaints. Only life, health, and small memories. "Dear Mother, I am well. We eat regularly. I work in the fields. I hope the house still stands." Each sentence was a bridge across oceans. Censors on both sides read every word. German and American officials ensured no secret codes or morale-breaking phrases. But beneath the ink, emotion survived, untouched by war. The human need to speak, to be remembered. In Camp Hearn, Texas, a special shed was dedicated to mail sorting. Thousands of envelopes, written in German script, filled wooden shelves. Prisoners volunteered to help organize them, respecting privacy. Handling those letters became a sacred duty. Photographs arrived occasionally. A wife, a child, a home in ruins. Some men smiled through tears. Others hid their photos in their lockers, unable to face the reminder. One soldier whispered, "I have forgotten my daughter's voice." Evening hours often turned silent. Men, gathered by dim lamps, rereading the same lines over and over. The camp around them seemed to fade, replaced by memories of laughter and Sunday dinners. It was the quietest sound of war. For those who received no letters, imagination became their only comfort. They invented scenes, mothers baking bread, fields untouched by bombs. The mind became a refuge stronger than walls. American guards noticed the change in atmosphere. They spoke softly during mail calls, understanding its importance. Some even helped translate unfamiliar phrases, bridging two worlds through compassion. It was a rare moment where enemy lines disappeared. In 1945, as news of Germany's collapse spread, the tone of letters shifted. No more confidence, no more talk of victory, only longing and questions with no answers. Is our city still there? Are you safe? Will I ever come home? One POW chaplain wrote in his diary, "We live between past and present. Each letter is a heartbeat from a dying homeland." The Red Cross tried to maintain morale, printing neutral newsletters. They reported world events carefully, omitting horrors. Yet everyone knew the war was nearly over, but not the pain. As summer arrived, letters slowed. Postal routes collapsed with Germany's surrender. Now silence replaced paper. It was the hardest silence they had ever known. In that silence, reflection deepened. The prisoners no longer dreamed of glory, but of rebuilding, not walls, but lives. They began to see that survival was more than staying alive. It was learning how to feel again. One evening, a POW musician composed a song on a borrowed accordion. It was called Brief nach Haus, Letter to Home. He played softly under the Texas sky, and for a moment, every man listening believed they could return, not as conquerors, but as men. When the German prisoners first saw the American factories, they thought it was an illusion. Rows of machines stretching farther than the eye could see, all running day and night. No slogans, no speeches, just motion. These men came from a Europe crippled by shortage. Back home, factories worked under constant bombing, lights dimmed and labor exhausted. Here, everything was alive, bright, steady, organized. In some regions, POWs were assigned to nearby industrial zones, working in lumber mills or food processing plants. They saw conveyors, hydraulic lifts, electric welders, tools of precision. One engineer whispered, "This is not production. This is civilization in motion." America's secret was not just power, but repetition. Every part could be replaced. Every man could be trained to perform one task perfectly. It was efficiency turned into culture. In one camp near Alabama, prisoners worked in a sawmill under civilian supervision. They watched how every piece of timber was measured, cut, labeled, and shipped, all by schedule. No officer shouting, no panic. The system itself gave orders. The Germans compared it quietly among themselves. The Reich had control, but America had coordination. One POW mechanic remarked, "In Germany, the state controls the people. In America, the system serves them." Trucks rolled through the camp gates daily, loaded with supplies marked with serial codes and batch numbers. Each label represented traceability, something Germany lacked under chaos. The sheer order of it all humbled even the most proud officers. Factories near the camps sometimes invited POW work crews for repairs. They saw women operating lathes, elderly men checking gauges, and teenage boys handling logistics. Every citizen seemed part of one massive network, not ruled, but connected. A diary from Camp Algona reads, "They have no genius commanders, no divine leaders, only millions of ordinary people working together. And that is their strength." The prisoners couldn't believe how open Americans were with information. Blueprints, manuals, and posters filled the workshops. Efficiency was not secret. It was shared. Knowledge was democracy. At night, when lights flickered across the plains, POWs stood silently by the fences. In the distance, they could see smokestacks and factory windows glowing. It was the pulse of a nation. Industry as faith. Some began sketching what they saw. Belt systems, motor layouts, storage facilities. They drew not as spies, but as students. Years later, these sketches would inspire engineers rebuilding post-war Germany. In camp discussions, officers debated the difference between control and cooperation. America had mastered both, without force. It was a revelation that would haunt many of them for decades. By late 1944, even the guards noticed a change in behavior. The POWs worked harder, spoke more respectfully, and asked more questions. The humiliation of defeat was fading, replaced by a strange admiration. One guard recalled, "They came as soldiers of the Reich. They left as witnesses of freedom powered by machinery." As the war drew to a close, the prisoners realized that the machines around them were not just engines of war. They were symbols of what a free society could build when it trusted its people more than its leaders. By 1944, time itself had become the real enemy inside the camps. Not hunger, not fear, just the slow, predictable rhythm of surviving another day. Every morning began the same way. Roll call, breakfast, assignment. The sound of boots on gravel became the soundtrack of captivity. Repetition shaped the mind like water carving stone. The POWs had learned to live between the lines of war. They built furniture, carved chess pieces, and wrote poetry on scraps of paper. Some found comfort in work, others in silence. The guards followed routine too. Inspections, reports, rotations. No cruelty, no surprise, just precision. War was happening thousands of miles away, yet order remained here like an echo. Inside the camp, life took on a rhythm almost civilian. Laundry lines fluttered between barracks. Men planted small gardens beside fences. Tomatoes, onions, flowers, symbols of a world that refused to die. The Red Cross encouraged these efforts. They delivered seeds, books, and sometimes musical instruments. Even captivity could have culture. A strange peace grew in the soil of defeat. For those who worked outside, the rhythm was different. Dawn in the fields, dusk on the trucks. The sun became their clock. Nature their only witness. Sundays were the quietest. No work, no shouting, only wind. Camp chaplains, both German and American, held brief services under open skies. Different languages, same prayers. One American guard later recalled, "We didn't see enemies. We saw men waiting for time to move again." The boredom was both gift and punishment. It stripped away the noise of ideology. In its place came reflection, slow, honest, unplanned. Some POWs turned their barracks into workshops. They carved wooden toys, built radios from scraps, and painted landscapes of imagined homes. For a moment, creation replaced captivity. Others withdrew into quiet endurance. They counted sunsets, memorized dates, and kept calendars on the walls. Each mark meant survival. Another day closer to release, or maybe forgiveness. When news of D-Day reached the camps, the reaction was muted. Some cheered quietly, others stared into the distance, victory or loss. None of it felt real anymore. They had lived too long in routine to feel triumph. Evenings brought card games, chess, and soft conversations. Laughter returned occasionally. Awkward, cautious, human. The war outside had taken millions. Inside the fences, men relearned how to live. Winter came again, with frost on the wires. The stoves burned low, the barracks cold. But by now, the men had adapted. Endurance had become second nature, and as 1945 approached, something subtle shifted. The fences no longer felt eternal. They had become part of a rhythm that would soon end, a rhythm that had taught them how to survive without hate. The war outside was ending, but inside the camps, silence grew heavier. News travelled slowly, carried by rumour, by radio, by letters that no longer came. Each whisper from Europe was a stone dropped into still water. By late 1944, the prisoners heard the word retaliation. Allied bombings had devastated their cities. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne. Some feared what would happen to their families. Others feared what would happen to them when the war was lost. Rumours spread through the barracks like smoke. Will they punish us? Will we ever go home? Even the most disciplined officers began to falter under the weight of uncertainty. One American guard noted, "Their confidence vanished in days. They looked like men carrying invisible ruins." For years, the Germans had seen themselves as the strongest army on earth. Now, they were prisoners of a nation that fought not through domination, but through endurance and machines. The contrast stung more than defeat itself. Red Cross bulletins confirmed the bombing of major German cities. Photographs arrived. Streets reduced to ash, cathedrals hollow, children in rubble. Men who once fought proudly now wept in silence. Home had become a memory buried under dust. A POW officer from Dresden refused to eat for days. He said, "If my family is gone, I am already free." His comrades said nothing. There was no comfort left to give. American guards noticed the shift. The laughter had faded. Work slowed. The air itself seemed heavier, as if every breath carried guilt. Yet the Americans did not retaliate. No cruelty, no revenge. Food portions remained the same. Routines continued with quiet respect. It was discipline without hatred. One POW sergeant wrote in his diary, "They have beaten us, and yet they do not hate us. That is what breaks me most." In those months, humanity became both weapon and mercy. The prisoners saw that restraint was the final proof of power. It changed them more than any battle could. When news of Hitler's death reached the camps, there was no celebration, only stunned silence. Some refused to believe. Others sat down and cried. For the first time, they no longer feared their captors. They feared their own history. The realization settled slowly. The empire they had served was gone. What remained was the question of who they were without it. American officers handled the transition carefully. They allowed chaplains to hold services, lowered tensions, and increased recreation time. Mercy became policy, not out of sympathy, but out of moral clarity. A guard from Camp Herne recalled years later, "We could have humiliated them. Instead, we showed them what victory without cruelty looked like." The lessons written in those quiet months would echo long after repatriation. Defeat had revealed more about character than any triumph could. For many German prisoners, that revelation would reshape how they lived the rest of their lives. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was breathing its last. But inside the camps of America, time still moved cautiously, like a man learning to walk again. Freedom was near, but it no longer felt simple. The news came not through speeches, but through whispers. Germany had surrendered, the Reich was gone, and with it, the last illusion of control. The guards made no announcement at first. They simply carried on. Roll call, meals, patrols. But the air felt different. Lighter somehow. The rhythm of captivity was starting to crack. POWs gathered in small groups, discussing what home meant now. Some cheered quietly, relieved that the killing had ended. Others stared at the dirt, uncertain if anything waited for them across the ocean. For months, they had lived under structure and order. Now the idea of freedom felt frightening. What world would they return to? What remained of their families? In Camp Algona, an officer pinned a small paper on the bulletin board. "The war is over. Germany surrenders unconditionally. Remain calm." The handwriting was steady, almost kind. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Some prisoners wept. Others stood frozen, staring at the words. They had survived. But survival did not feel like victory. It felt like standing on the edge of an unknown future. American guards treated them with quiet respect. No parades, no insults, just procedure, paperwork, instructions, waiting for transport orders. It was liberation with discipline. The Red Cross arrived daily now, processing records and medical reports. Each man was photographed, fingerprinted, and classified for return. For the first time, the fences were no longer symbols of captivity, but of order holding chaos at bay. Many POWs asked to stay longer, fearing what awaited them in ruins back home. Others volunteered to help rebuild the camps themselves, cleaning, repairing, teaching new arrivals. Work had become a comfort they didn't want to lose. In evenings, the camp loudspeakers played soft radio broadcasts, news of Europe, of peace, of rebuilding. Men listened in silence, their faces lit by faint light bulbs. No cheers, no applause, just the sound of history exhaling. A diary entry from May 1945 reads, "We are free men again, but the fences inside us will take longer to fall." In the following weeks, trucks began arriving, marked repatriation corps. Prisoners lined up, names checked, records signed. Each departure was quiet, almost ceremonial. As buses rolled away, American guards saluted them. It was not triumph, it was closure. Two sides of a war recognizing each other as survivors. Some prisoners left small gifts behind, carvings, chess sets, drawings, tokens of time and memory, proof that even in confinement, humanity had endured. By summer's end, most camps had emptied. The fences remained, but the noise was gone. Only the wind carried the echoes of footsteps. The last rhythm of men who had once been enemies, now simply men who understood the cost of war. The road home began not with joy, but with quiet disbelief. After years behind fences, freedom arrived without fanfare. Just papers, buses, and the smell of diesel. Men who had been prisoners now faced the unknown again. At dawn, columns of trucks rolled out of the camps. each filled with silent faces, hands gripping duffel bags of meager belongings. A few turned back for one last look at the barracks that had once been their world. Wood, wire, routine, now memories. The journey to the East Coast took days, through plains, forests, and cities untouched by bombs. From the windows, the prisoners saw what they had long suspected. America had fought a war without destruction on its soil. Its homes still stood, its roads unbroken. At ports like New York, Norfolk, and Boston, ships waited under grey skies. Vessels once used for troops now carried the defeated back to Europe. Names were called, identification checked. Each man stepped forward not as a soldier, but as a remnant of history. American guards shook their hands before boarding. It was a small gesture, brief, respectful, human. Some POWs whispered thanks, others could only nod. On deck, the men watched the shoreline fade into mist. Behind them lay the land of abundance and efficiency, a place that had shown them both power and compassion. Ahead was a homeland they no longer recognized. The Atlantic was rough that spring. The ships moved slowly, heavy with cargo and conscience. Conversations drifted between disbelief and anxiety. What if no one is left? What if we are not welcome? Days turned into routine once more. Meals, duties, silence. Only now the fences were gone, yet the feeling remained. Freedom felt unfamiliar. The ocean became another kind of prison, vast and cold. One POW officer wrote in his log, "We are free, but we no longer know who we are returning to." When the ships reached European ports, Le Havre, Southampton, Bremerhaven, the sight was devastating. Ruins stretched for miles, factories burned, railways broken, cities hollowed by fire. The men stood on deck in silence. They were home, but it didn't look like home anymore. American officers handed them over to Allied authorities. Paperwork again, questions again, camps again. Repatriation was slow, bureaucratic, and impersonal. Some waited months before returning to their actual towns, if those towns still existed. For many, the hardest part of war had just begun. The rebuilding of lives, trust, and meaning. They had seen both sides of humanity, the one that destroys and the one that rebuilds, and they would carry both forever. A chaplain said to one departing group, "You will not go back as the men you were. Perhaps that is the only victory left." As the last ships docked, the war truly ended, not in gunfire, but in silence. The silence of men stepping onto a land they no longer understood, carrying within them the strange, steady rhythm of a world that had changed them. Years after their return, the memories of captivity did not fade. They lived quietly in the minds of those who had crossed oceans and survived without fighting. For them, the war's loudest lessons had come in silence. The experience had divided their lives into two eras, before the fences and after. Before was obedience, command, ideology. After was patience, structure, and the discovery of dignity and discipline. Many of them spoke little of America, but their habits carried traces of it. Clean order, punctuality, methodical work, learned not from victory, but from captivity. They had seen a nation powerful without cruelty. That truth stayed deeper than any uniform. In villages across West Germany, small groups of former POWs met occasionally, not to relive war, but to discuss life, how to rebuild families, how to raise children without hate, how to serve peace. Their gatherings became invisible classrooms of reflection. A former Luftwaffe mechanic once said, "We learned that freedom is not chaos, it is responsibility shared." For some, captivity had been the first time they'd met real democracy. Rules that protected even the enemy. Order built from trust. They began to understand that civilization was not born of fear, but of fairness. Psychologists who interviewed them years later found a pattern. Those who had spent time in American camps adjusted faster to post-war life. They had experienced structure without oppression and learned cooperation through routine. A farmer from Bavaria explained, "We were conquered by kindness more than by weapons." These reflections rippled quietly through the post-war generation. Children of former POWs grew up hearing about America not as the enemy, but as a place where work had meaning and justice had balance. It became part of Germany's slow transformation. The Red Cross archives later recorded letters of gratitude sent by former prisoners. They thanked guards by name, described lessons learned from camp libraries and classrooms. Some even sent photographs of their rebuilt homes. Proof that order and mercy could coexist. By the late 1940s, few talked about revenge. Instead, they talked about endurance, efficiency, and human decency. The war had shown them destruction. Captivity had shown them design. One had burned their world. The other had taught them how to rebuild it. The quiet lessons of captivity became the moral blueprints for a new era, not written in books, but lived in gestures, in the way they worked, taught and treated others. That was the true reconstruction, the rebuilding of conscience. The war was over, but peace had no clear shape. Germany was divided, its cities hollow, its people displaced, and among them walked men who had once been prisoners in a foreign land, carrying lessons no one had asked them to learn. They returned quietly. No parades, no banners, no songs, just silence, ruins, and the slow recognition that the world they left no longer existed. Every corner reminded them of what had been lost. Some came home to find strangers in their houses. Others found nothing at all. Their towns were unrecognizable, rubble where memory once stood. The smell of dust replaced the sound of familiar voices. In that emptiness, they began again. They built with their hands, traded tools, shared rations. Years of captivity had taught them patience, precision, and humility. Now, those same habits became the foundation for survival. Former officers worked as farmers, carpenters, mechanics. Some joined reconstruction brigades organized by the Allies. They built schools, bridges, homes, not out of duty, but necessity. Work became redemption. And beneath the surface, something new was forming. An understanding that discipline could serve peace as well as war. That cooperation could rebuild faster than command could destroy. This was the quiet revolution of the defeated. In American camps, they had seen organization without cruelty, power without fear. Now they tried to imitate it, not perfectly but with sincerity. They learned that dignity could exist without domination. A teacher from Bremen reopened his classroom in a half-burned school. He began every lesson with the same words. "We are not rebuilding Germany. We are rebuilding people." Slowly, the stigma of defeat turned into purpose. The men who had worked the fields of Texas and the mills of Iowa carried knowledge of efficiency, structure, and humanity. They applied it to a new world, one without uniforms, without slogans. Some joined local councils, others became craftsmen or engineers. Many never spoke of captivity again, but their silence carried weight, the kind born of understanding rather than shame. They had seen another way to live. By 1947, West Germany was stirring with quiet energy. The Marshall Plan arrived and factories rose from ruins. To outsiders, it looked like recovery. To the former POWs, it felt like reflection made tangible. They worked methodically, without anger, without pride. They wanted their children to see order, not destruction, to believe that strength came from unity, not ideology. That was their unspoken legacy. One ex-prisoner wrote in his memoir, "In America, we saw how power can be gentle. Now we build our country on that memory." The transformation was not instant. Guilt lingered like dust in the corners of every home. But it mixed with determination, forming something resilient, something human. And though history would remember them as captives, they knew the truth. Their captivity had been the beginning of their freedom. Time moved on. The camps were dismantled. The barracks torn down. The fences melted into steel for new cities. Only the wind remembered the names. Across the American plains where those camps once stood, nothing marks their presence. Just open fields, wild grass, and the faint outline of a foundation swallowed by time. But beneath that silence, stories still breathe. For decades, few spoke of it. The guards grew old. The prisoners aged quietly. Letters faded, photos yellowed, and memory became inheritance. Yet, the lessons endured, unseen but alive. Some former POWs returned to America years later, as tourists, engineers, even friends. They walked the same soil where they had once stood behind wire. No guards, no orders, only gratitude. They came to thank the nation that had conquered them with fairness. In small museums and local archives, their stories resurfaced. Camp diaries, carved toys, handmade chessboards. Objects of survival turned into artifacts of understanding. Each one whispered the same truth, that humanity, even in war, can choose mercy. In Germany, their children built new lives. They studied, created, voted freely. Their schools taught democracy, not dogma. And unknowingly, they lived by principles born in American camps. Historians later called it the quiet conversion, not of religion, but of thought, an awakening seeded in captivity, rooted in respect. One American officer wrote, decades after the war, "We didn't intend to teach them. We only treated them as men. The rest, they learned on their own." That quiet dignity became the true legacy. Not the machines, not the battles, but the simple proof that order and compassion could coexist, and that freedom, once witnessed, could never be forgotten. Today, the descendants of those men live in peace. They drive on roads their fathers helped repair. They study in schools their grandfathers helped build. And in that silent continuity lies the triumph neither side expected. The legacy of the POWs is not carved in stone. It lives in conduct, in fairness, in restraint. The silence that remains is not emptiness, it is understanding, and perhaps that is the loudest victory of all.